Monday 23rd of January 2012. The European Union has decided from today on to impose an embargo on Iranian petrol. This common EU foreign policy agreement is imposed in order to put pressure on Iran to force this state to give up its nuclear research and development. It's not the first time in history that state commercial allies are put in under embargo. Even though results and duration vary, the signal given is strong and aims to weaken and isolate a state in order to impose a change on its internal or foreign policy. If the EU, already weakened by internal issues, can hold such an embargo is uncertain. But to Simon Lightfoot, European politics lecturer at Leeds University, the morality of this decision is more important than its actual result.
Well, I think the European Union has limited powers in terms of military power, but it does have a kind of moral power, and clearly taking a position like it has over Iran links into its moral position about nuclear weapons, and therefore I'm not necessarily sure it's a win-lose situation, but the important point is that the European Union is facing the challenge of Iran and nuclear weapons. I think the important point is that we talk in politics a lot about as if people win or lose and it's a zero sum, that you either win or you lose. But I think it's important to look at this in much more sophisticated terms than that, and it's a case of looking at why the European Union's made this decision, whether it's got any chance of succeeding in relation to making Iran change its position. But also it tells us something interesting about the European Union itself.
Okay, what does it tell us?
How easy it is or how difficult it will be for 27 countries with different foreign policy priorities and various other things to come together and stick to an agreement. It's quite hard when you think about making an agreement with 27 countries. That's not an easy thing to do, particularly for countries like Greece or Italy or Hungary that rely very heavily on Iranian oil. It's a much more of a different situation for a country which relies very little on Iranian oil to take a very high moral stance. It's much more difficult for Greece or Italy to take that kind of stance, and yet they have done. And I think that's quite important. And clearly the European Union, the crucial word there is union, it's only going to have any power if it sticks together.
Can on a long-term basis it be possible to keep this embargo?
I think the economic problems of Spain and Italy and Greece are obviously well documented. I would be amazed if a deal had been decided. If you've made a decision to have an oil embargo on Iran, the Greeks in particular wanted an 8-month transition period, which was rejected. So there must be a position that they are aware of the fact that those countries are able to make up their stocks from other places. Whether they've got a deal with Saudi Arabia to increase oil production in Saudi Arabia, whether the Libyan pipelines are going to be coming back on stream. It's not a kind of a cynical view of politics, but clearly you don't make a decision that's going to lead to a country like Greece, which is already in a very difficult position, having 30% of its oil, which is not going to come into the country. That's just, to me, not realistic politics. So the point being is that the European Union it's a relatively new actor in terms of its formal power, but it's not a kind of a teenager. It knows what it's doing, and therefore there must be some sense that they were able to reassure the Greeks and the Spanish and the Italians that they would be able to make up the oil from somewhere else. I'd be amazed if they were taking a moral position without understanding the full consequences.
You think it was a pretty sudden decision?
I think this has been something that the European Union has been talking about for a long time, and one of its problems is that it keeps on talking and never does anything. So therefore, the foreign ministers met, the European foreign representative, Baroness Ashton, was clearly taking a line on this, and I think it got to a point with the Iranians where they just decided they had to make a stance, and clearly other actors in particular making stances, whether it's going to be as effective as they'd like in terms of can they actually enforce an embargo, will the surplus just be picked up by China, who's desperate for raw materials. But then again, you cannot make those kind of moral decisions unless we've got to import oil, because otherwise it'll just go to the Chinese, because that's a difficult sort of position to have and to explain to people.
The majority of their exportation goes to India and China, and only a really small amount goes to Europe. Do you really think it can be a way?
It's an interesting question. It depends. I mean, whether the embargo is effective in changing policy positions on the Iranians, I'm not necessarily convinced. It's obviously the aim of what the European Union is trying to achieve, but the first point is it takes a position. It's a bit like in terms of South Africa under apartheid. We could very easily have taken a position in certain countries that, it doesn't matter because other countries will still deal with South Africa. But that doesn't change the moral repugnance that we had about apartheid. Not necessarily an exact correlation, but if we are trying to tell the Iranians that we don't think they should be developing a nuclear capability, whether they will be able to sell their oil to India or China is separate from the moral position that we have to adopt in the European Union in particular, of saying we think this is wrong, what are we able to do about it? I think the European Union has limited powers. An angry letter from Baroness Ashton may not go down terribly well in Tehran, but I can't imagine it's going to be the scariest thing they've ever come across. Whereas an absolute oil embargo, which may have an impact on the political elite in Iran, might be a more effective message that we're serious about this.
European Union putting an embargo on Iran, knowing that we will still deal with Saudi Arabia and Libya, can there be any tension between Middle East and Europe linked to
that? I mean, that's a hugely speculative question. I think, from what I understand, Iran is not exactly a friendly neighbour to places like Saudi Arabia, so therefore I think there's a position being taken by different Arab states about Iran that clearly anything that goes on between Iran and the European Union or America and Iran that raises tensions in the region is going to cause concern. But again, I can't imagine that America wouldn't, sailing their fleet into the Straits of Hormuz is going to be done without having negotiated and discussed with the Saudis and other actors, and I'm sure not necessarily a green light, but there must have been some kind of sense of this is what was going to happen. And again, I think that the power, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then that is potentially more destabilising to the region than an oil embargo.
Do you think it's a good start to maybe push more on pro-green energy resources?
I think the European Union has been doing a lot on particularly reducing its carbon emissions. It's got quite ambitious targets to reduce its carbon emissions. It's got quite ambitious plans for green energy. I think it seems logical that if you're relying on a resource that's running out, you look for alternatives for that. The difficulty is we're in a very serious recession, and therefore anything that's going to potentially raise... Because if we raise petrol prices by whatever, that's going to have a knock-on effect on the price of food. Obviously oil is important for so many different commodities, plastics, etc. So that will again raise the prices, and that will again potentially have a negative impact on the economy. But at the same time, there's clearly something that needs to be done for climate change. You look at what the European Union has done over the years, particularly in the Durban summit just before Christmas on climate change. It was again trying to push other actors to make a more ambitious target for global reductions of carbon. So I see this not as necessarily as if the foreign ministers have sat down with the environment ministers, but it does fit in with a kind of a plan that the European Union is trying to balance that its reliance and our reliance on... I think this is the other problem, is that we often see this as it's the European Union or government, whereas I drive a car, I buy goods, I have need plastics, etc., etc., etc. So therefore it's a case of all of us thinking about how we can live our lives differently. And also, in terms of the foreign policy of the European Union, what else is there that we can do with Iran? I assume we could put in targeted sanctions like they've done in other countries, but this is something that is, if there's no point looking at, a ban on flowers from Iran if Iran doesn't sell any flowers. So again, it's this point about sanctions. It's got to be on something, or an embargo. It's got to be on something which is going to make a significant effect, or else it just becomes a meaningless act.
Do you think it's a positive sign towards the euro crisis, the fact that the European Union has come to put an embargo on Iran, knowing that they have so much problem discussing their internal problems?
I think any signs of unity are going to be a positive sign. Iran nuclear weapons is a very, very clear bad thing in the European Union eyes, whereas liberalising markets has got a much more of a different opinion. David Cameron might think more liberalisation is good. The IMF might think more liberalisation is good. Liberalisation for Greek workers or Italian workers means losing their jobs, working longer for less pay, losing pensions. There's less of a clear-cut right or wrong. So again, I think that's sometimes the issue with foreign policy is foreign policy can appear, I don't mean easy in the terms that it isn't necessarily. The fact that, we can just make an easy decision, let's put an oil embargo on Iran. But at the same time, it's very clear that that's a much more clear, that we in the European Union, I use the term we as the ministers, think that Iran is a state that we are going to have trouble with, and therefore we, the European Union, have a very clear position on this. Whereas that's much easier than taking a very clear position on, say, something like liberalising of markets or flexible working or something like that. So sometimes foreign policy decisions can be a little bit more straightforward because there's a definite or appearance of a definite right or wrong, which is less obvious when it comes to domestic politics.
Do you have an educated guess on the effect it can have on a long-term base on the euro?
The long term. I think the great thing about politics is you should never say never, because we don't know. I think the connection between this and the euro, I think they're very different things, and all we can take is the fact that if the European Union is able to come up with a unified position, if it can stick to that unified position, which is clearly something that historically member states have struggled, when the 27 have made a decision, if people stick to that decision, then that's great. But there have been occasions where countries haven't, and that has caused problems. Once one country breaks, not necessarily an embargo, but what breaks, say, a political protocol, then there isn't all of the 27 other members, or to all the other 26. If it's one state, will learn sort of, well, why am I keeping an embargo? But I think that does show that, in a European Union, it's trying to find the common cause. And again, that comes back to the point about winning or losing, is it isn't necessarily as easy as that. And one of the problems is it's the complexity that's very difficult. So trying to find a solution to the European or the euro crisis is something that's more complex, because it isn't about winning and losing. It's about different domestic politics. It's about domestic politics in an election year in France, in election years in other member states, and this is a difficult sort of position to get across to people, that how do you, it's in human nature. If I got asked to give up for 5 years for benefits down the road, and how's that going to work?
You said there is no win, no lose. And in this case, what is the point?
I think what it is it's, if you look at politics just in winning or losing, then that makes it too simplistic. So clearly there is a position that the European Union, by taking this stance, hopes to change policy in Iran. If not, it's also able to prove that it's a unified actor, which is important internally, but also it is able to add to the moral pressure. I think that's one of the things that's often overlooked, is that one of the things about South Africa, for example, in terms of apartheid, was it was just the pressure of the sporting boycotts, the embargoes, etc., the isolation, which gradually puts pressure on. Now, clearly, I'm not an expert on Iran, but there are different forces at work in Iran, and therefore this embargo may help to strengthen forces that we would regard as easier to work with, and it may weaken, it may not. But I think part of the thing for the European Union and any other actor in dealing with Iran or other states that may be in a position to threaten the West in that sense through something like nuclear weapons, then you've got to take a stance. It's, well, how else would you do it? Otherwise, no one would take stances. We would just let anything that we don't like just happen. And I think that's where it's more complicated. It's not something that you'll better say after 90 minutes or 5.5 hours, as like the Australian tennis. Someone has won, because it's something that will take time, and it's very difficult to isolate a factor. It could be that this, in conjunction with pressure from its neighbours, or the European Union and America putting pressure on China and India, or putting pressure on Russia or whatever, is able to then just slowly put pressure on the Iranian elites to change their minds. Clearly, there is a potential that it all goes the other way, and this pressure pushes Iran into a corner, and they're much more sort of defiant and more willing to sort of take extreme positions. But I think the point being is that it's difficult to see it as a kind of win or lose, because we aren't really in that. Politics isn't like that, apart from elections. But even in elections, you look at the last British election, who won? We've got a government, but you cannot necessarily say in a very clear sense that there's a winner or a loser. There is a government formed, and that's the important point. So I think it's just trying to get across to people that when we look at, it's very easy in a British context that politics often seems, David Cameron's had a bad day, he's lost. Ed Miliband's had a good day, he's won. But it's much more complicated than that, and that's not meant in a patronising way, but it's about thinking about the decisions that people are taking and the compromises that people make.
This was Simon Lightfoot, European politics lecturer at Leeds University, speaking about the European embargo on Iranian petrol. The American political scientist Harold Laswood said, "Politics is who gets what, when, and how." Imposing an embargo reflects the idea that the past, the present, and the future coexist in politics. Only time will show for which generation the results will be.